I recently became aware of something today that I was not aware of earlier, and that is the expression negative preaching and positive preaching. I was never aware of this. This is the first time I've heard these actual two-word expressions. Negative preaching is an expression, and positive preaching is an expression. And in the world of homiletics and ministry, these are actual phrases that are tossed around. Believe it or not. Why? Why don't you just do Bible preaching and let the Bible speak for itself, whether it's positive or negative? Just preach it. Why do you got to put it into categories? It's so ridiculous. But a recent sermon that I posted by Andrew Strom brought that to my attention, that there are people who consider preaching about hell and the day of judgment, they call that negative preaching. So I got curious and I looked back into some old Google books. It's one of the things I like to do. I like to go back historically and look. And I found this right up called Discussions. It's a book called Discussions by R.L. Dabney. He was a conservative Presbyterian theologian. And the expression negative preaching apparently started to appear in the late 1800s. And it was originally used to describe the preaching of liberals in the Unitarian denomination, which is where apparently liberalism started in the Unitarian Universalist Church, and then through books and stuff, through its sentiments, spread into the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Congregational Church, Episcopal Church. So all this, what we call the Sisters of Mainline Liberalism didn't start off liberal. It was the Unitarians that were the source of liberalism. And so most people preached fundamentalism. Most of the denominations used to preach fundamentalism in the 1600s and 1700s. Whether you were Presbyterian or Methodist or Episcopal, it didn't matter. There was pretty much a fundamentalist Bible-believing sentiment, belief in hell and belief in the day of judgment. And that was part of sermons. But when the Unitarians started to gain more influence in the late 1800s, with Darwinism coming in and higher criticism coming in, the Unitarian ministers started to do what they called negative preaching. And they preached against hell. They preached against stuff. They preached against fundamentalism. And that was called negative preaching, to preach against the things about fundamentalism that they didn't like. That was called negative preaching. And so that's how they spread liberalism, to decrease people's faith in those harder doctrines of the Bible. R.L. Dabney said this: "These things have been done in high places. Time would fail to tell of the unhealthy signs manifesting themselves in a multitude of churches of less note, of the flood of negative preaching in which the unpalatable old-fashioned truths of depravity, predestination, eternal punishments are silently but systematically pretermitted, of ruling elders who never read the confession they swore to uphold," referring to the Westminster Confession, "and who flout its distinctive doctrines with disdain, of the torrent of worldly conformities, lascivious dances, theater-goings, and often dissipations which have come into nominally Christian families." So there you have it. Basically, carnality coming in, and negative preaching against the fear of God. That's what liberalism is. Liberalism is an anti-Christian movement in the Christian churches. It's an anti-Christian movement. It's an anti-biblical movement in the Christian churches. And so created a culture of what came to be acceptable, which the expression negative preaching eventually switched because liberalism became so popular. The expression negative preaching continued, but it changed its definition over time. So that by the 1990s, right, negative preaching came to mean the opposite. Negative preaching came to mean preaching anything that was negative in nature. Whereas in the 1890s, negative preaching was a liberal standing in his liberal pulpit, preaching against hell, preaching against depravity, and preaching against the day of judgment, preaching against the blood of Jesus. Whereas 100 years later, 1990s, negative preaching meant anybody who dares to preach about hell or the day of judgment or the blood of Jesus. And this is all considered just negative. Like, you're a negative person with a bad personality if you do that. Of course, it's never called Bible preaching. It's called negative to cast aspersions on it, to make it look bad, and to make the person look mentally ill who's just trying to be faithful to the Bible.